Hello everybody, my name is Michael Harkey. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. This is the encore presentation of the How to Review the SOC 1 or SOC 2. So, on to our main event. Many of you may already know Dan as the moderator of the Fall Information Security Conference for the Indiana Bankers Association. He runs our company, Infotex, which is a managed security services firm as well as an IT audit firm. He has 13 letters after his name, and they're all about information security. He's the awareness guru from Indiana, and his spreadsheets are legendary. Dan?
Thank you very much, Mike. Good morning, everybody. I tell you, before I get started, I'd like to go back to this here. Mike basically was reading exactly what I wanted him to say there, but I didn't like the way it sounded. This is the first time we've done this. Our lawyers are bouncing off the walls about the fact that we are holding these webinars, and of course, you know, we are consultants that take great pride in being right about our consultations, etc. But and by the way, what we're talking about today, the SSAE-16 checklist. I mean, SSAE-16, the AICPA switched to that format in 2010. So what I'm teaching today is definitely, you know, settled law, so to speak. And I don't think that, you know, anything I'm going to say today is subject to change. But last year, we had a series of webinars in the first quarter that were predicting a new guidance from the FFIEC that ended up becoming the cybersecurity assessment tool, which if you've been in banking, you know that the cybersecurity assessment tool isn't really a guidance. And so, you know, we were right about a lot of that prediction, and I actually called it the CAT, the non-guidance guidance, because the FFIEC was careful to say it's not a guidance, but they're requiring most of their banks to come up to baseline, at least in terms of, you know, that cybersecurity assessment. So last year, the first 3 or 4 webinars we gave, I was slightly wrong in my predictions, but I was right in a lot of predictions, and I felt like it really helped our clients and our webinar attendees get ready. Again, this year, one of the baseline statements that came out of that cybersecurity assessment tool was the call for data flow diagrams. And though the cybersecurity assessment tool was published way back in June 30th of 2015, there really was no guidance in terms of what the FFIEC wanted for data flow diagrams. And so in February of this year, and by the way, we have a movie available for it that you can see, but in February of this year, we went ahead and came out with a webinar that basically established this is what we think the FFIEC should mean when they talk about data flow diagrams. And so my point is that when we did our legal risk assessment, because like most banks, I mean, we do a risk analysis every year, and this year, boy, our risk analysis went on and on and on forever because we had already decided we were going to do a legal risk analysis. And then, of course, we put our company through the cybersecurity assessment. And so anyway, one of the things that came out of it was this little slide that we have to make available to you here. So what we found is that when we transferred over and added the new slides, it kind of took all the formatting out of the last presentation. So I'm giving the same presentation I gave last year. I should say this presentation we delivered, I think, in January or something of this year. And so bear with me as I, you know, talk to you about the need to focus in on how we review SOC 1 or a SOC 2. And really what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start off by explaining that there's a lot of different ways you can walk away from this webinar. I feel like there's going to be a lot of deliverables for you. But I also know that there's several people that are attending who are attending because they're vendor owners. There's people who are attending because they have a really good fine-tuned vendor management program, and they're just wanting to find better ways to review the SOC 2, which is really a very important component of a vendor management program. We'll talk about the SSAE-16 standard. I have a sample SSAE-16 report that the AICPA Society has made available. And then I'll talk about how Infotex goes through an SSAE-16 and how we review it and then I'll finish with, some suggestions to make your reporting easier and more effective so that we're not bogging people down with detail unless they need that detail. And so I feel like if you're brand new, if you're a novice when it comes to the vendor management process at large, I have invited a couple of the Infotex data security analysis, or analysts, I should say, to the webinar, just because I feel like this might help them connect the dots in terms of, what we're doing as a vendor to banks. But I do believe that you will be able to gain a lot from this webinar. But I also want to make sure that you realize that you're not going to really fully understand the vendor management process or even how to review a SOC 2 just by attending a 1-hour webinar. This is a great introduction for you, but you need to really understand, the context that the SOC 2 fits into, and that varies from bank to bank, all depending on how their auditors, and their examiners have developed and evolved their vendor management program. I have a lot of audit clients I see when I look at the attendee list who are wanting to take their vendor management program to the next level. Some of them are actually outsourcing SOC 2 reviews to various players, including Infotex, but end contracts and digital compliance and other vendors that are in the business of reviewing SOC 2s. And I know they're here because they just kind of want to see how that works. Maybe they can, handle it on their own, or maybe what they'll do is they'll outsource the review of the critical vendors, and then, eventually, learn how to review the non-critical vendors or the high-risk vendors or whatever their vendor management program calls them. Likewise, I do have a few track users who, track has a really good checklist that's very similar to our checklist, except for the fact that the expected controls actually come right out of the IT risk assessment from track. So it's kind of handy in terms of knowing what controls to expect from a third party. But the checklist is rather slow compared to an Excel spreadsheet. And so what some of my clients have taken to do is they're using our Excel spreadsheet for the actual review, and then they upload that to track and store that where they're storing the rest of their vendor management data, and that kind of makes sense to me. And then, of course, we also have SOC 2 review clients where, they're outsourcing their SOC 2 reviews to Infotex, and I know the reason why they're here is because they're hoping that maybe they can do, again, some of their less critical vendors on their own, or maybe next year, instead of having us do it for, $600 a pop, maybe they can go ahead and update it based on the new SOC that's reviewed. And I just want to make sure that they know they don't need to feel guilty about that. We totally understand where they're coming from, and so we're more than happy to, help them and answer questions as they get started doing their own reviews. And then finally, there's information security professionals, vendor management professionals that already have a method of reviewing SOC 2s down, and they're just looking for ways to improve their own methods. And again, we're totally okay with that. Part of the deal when you sign up for this webinar is that we're going to provide our boilerplates to you. If you are in the business, if you are a competitor, we always appreciate if you give us, some kudos or say, hey, this is the Infotex tool that that we've modified, we've taken to a better level than Infotex had it, and if you can let us know what you think is wrong with it. We really enjoy partnering with audit firms and other people that are, I'm using air quotes around the word competitors. But the long and short of it is that you need to have some prerequisites in place before you even get to the point where you're reviewing a SOC 1 or 2. And really, the vendor management program that you have in place is ultimately going to lead towards the notion that we need to review assurance documents that our third parties are providing to us, because it's a very important component of what I call the 4 promises. So when I teach vendor management at a high level, and by the way, the IBA has scheduled me to do my vendor management workshop in December of this year, so it's quite a wait. But when I do teach vendor management, I talk about the 4 promises. And don't get me wrong, contracts, there's a whole contract review checklist. But if you can just remember that the contract needs to promise that we're not going to share information unless you give us permission to, that if we break that first promise, that we will have systems in place and that we promise we'll notify you that, oops, we made a mistake and we shared information without your permission. And then the third promise is that we will put controls in place to make sure we can keep promise 1 and 2. And then finally, the fourth promise is we'll participate in a due diligence process to help you know that we have those controls in place and that they're working. And so that due diligence process includes a review of insurance and a review of financial statements. And because SOC 2s very rarely look at business continuity plans, it also includes a review of business continuity plans. And then finally, ultimately, it should include a review of assurance information. And assurance information can be in many different forms, but what we're talking about today is the primary form that's kind of evolved over the years, and that is the SOC 2 or the SOC 1. Before we get there, though, most vendor management programs are at a policy level requiring the information security officer or the vendor management coordinator or the compliance officer, the risk officer, whoever was the unlucky person that got the hat put on their head, said you're going to be the one that answers these questions that the auditors and examiners are asking about third-party management. The policy is basically going to establish that we need to sort our vendors by inherent risk. What risk do they present to us just because we're doing business with them, whether they have any controls in place or not. And there's 4 categories. The regulated category is always one that's kind of a gray area. And, I hear banks say, oh, the reason why the FFIEC allows us to have a regulated category is because our examiners that fall into that category and they don't want to sign non-disclosure agreements and give us their financial statements and all that kind of stuff. And so I'd like to just kind of give you a bird's eye view of a typical vendor management program. It really starts because vendors expose us to risk, but most banks, and I'm really talking small banks under about $3 billion, they didn't really start their vendor management program until their auditors or possibly their examiners started pointing to the fact that the FFIEC requires us to measure and respond to the risk that we face because we're allowing third parties to have information or to have access to information. And the most recent guidance that was published about vendor management is the OCC Bulletin 2013-29, which means it came out in 2013. It's a little bit, tested now. And while it does create a lot of work, we love it because it really does spell out what needs to happen point by point if you want to comply with the letter of the regulation that was published by the FFIEC way back in, I think it was in 2003, maybe 2004 when they first published their regulation. And it also, adds some detail into what we should look for when we review a contract, etc. And so that kind of created the need from an IT compliance perspective to establish a vendor management program that starts with a board policy that basically, A, informs the board we're exposing ourselves to risk whenever we engage with a third party that receives information or that has access to information. And we should sort those vendors by inherent risk, measure the risk, and report back to the board whenever we're exposed to high or critical risk from a residual risk perspective. And then that, policy usually says the information security officer will document a procedure for doing all that. And what we've kind of, evolved is 3 different processes that need to be established because of this policy. First, a policy for addressing new vendors, or a process, I should say, a process for contract review, and then finally a process for due diligence. And the threshold analysis, I kind of talked to you about that a little bit. That is the sorting of the vendors by inherent risk. And it really should dictate how much due diligence we should do on our vendors. So if we've got a vendor that represents very low inherent risk, we shouldn't have to do anything with them. If we have a vendor that represents critical inherent risk, we really want to look under their skin. We really want to understand, what kind of controls we should expect, what kind of controls they have in place, and then are they testing those controls? Because as we've learned, most of us thought we had a good vendor management program back in 2004, 2005 when we interpreted the guidance. And it wasn't until our auditors and examiners came in and tested our program that we realized that, hey, we needed to take it to the next level. And that's probably why most of you are here today, is because somebody is testing your vendor management program. And then the ultimate deliverable that comes out of the vendor management program is the board report, which really should simplify the results and the process, et cetera. And we'll talk about that pretty, quickly. Who is involved in vendor management? I'm kind of noticing the time here, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it involves pretty much, everybody in the management team of a bank, because we don't want people hiring vendors unless they're management. And so the vendor owner has to be involved in the vendor management program because A, have the relationship with the vendor, B, if there are any controls that we need to enforce in order to mitigate risk exposure, they're the ones that are enforcing those controls or making their team members enforce those controls. And then finally, ultimately, they should understand the risk that their vendor is exposing them to, because we believe that awareness is 9/11 of the battle, and therefore that awareness itself will help manage the risk that vendors are exposing us to. But, we have third-party providers we already kind of talked about, and so the process really is that the vendor management policy requires us to sort vendors by inherent risk. We call that a threshold analysis. And then based on that, we will request due diligence. And really, depending on the criticality of the vendor, all depends on how much of this due diligence we would insist upon. Our recommendation is you request on it. You request it all, but you don't insist upon it for moderate or low-risk vendors. And then the assurance that you get from high-risk vendors doesn't have to be as robust as the assurance you get from critical risk vendors. We also believe that any vendor that's going to have possession or access to information should have some form of insurance, maybe cybersecurity insurance, maybe, some errors and omission insurance, et cetera, so that, if there is a problem, if there is a breach, they are transferring the impact of that breach to somebody else. Once we've determined which due diligence, we want to put the vendors through, and once we send them that due diligence request, I would say 60% of the battle is getting them to respond to that request and then sorting out their response into what we're looking for. And we usually have some kind of a due diligence checklist, and really that's what we're talking about today. Is the SOC 2 is really a due diligence checklist. And then what we're going to do is we're going to try to look for missing controls and document, here's all the controls that we would like to have in place, but they're missing. And then we risk rank those missing controls. And then what we do is we go back to our vendors for any kind of missing controls that we feel represent higher critical risk. We don't care if they're missing something that doesn't mitigate a lot of risk. So, if you're working with a cleaning company and they don't have a business continuity program, who cares? But if they're not doing background checks on their employees that they're putting in our branches after hours, maybe we should go back and talk to them about that. And if they can't afford to do it, maybe we volunteer to do it for them. But that process is probably the most important process. And what I want you to know is that the SOC 2 review, this process right here, is all about figuring out what controls are missing so we can risk rank them and then have our vendor owners go back over the course of next year and try to determine, what are you doing about this? The SOC 2 is a great SOC 2. You didn't have any deficiencies, but you're a network, provider and you don't have intrusion prevention on your network. Why? And a lot of times the answer is, well, we do have it. We just didn't have them audit it because we have that audited in our vulnerability assessment every year. And I can give you an affidavit that says, we do the vulnerability assessments and the findings are either low risk or they're always mitigated immediately or whatever. But ultimately then the results of the vendor management program, when it comes to whatever residual risk is left, should then be entered into our risk management program so we can do something about it. And then finally, we want to report to the board, because remember that vendor management policy at the board level said report back to us anytime residual risk is high or critical. And the board report, by the way, should really just explain, here's what we did, and here's how we decided what to report to you. And then the report itself should be risk-centric, vulnerability-centric, not vendor-centric. I audit banks where they feel like they have to give the board this big long list of all their vendors, and it really is more of an inherent risk assessment that basically says we've sorted our vendors into critical risk, high risk, blah, blah, blah. But all that is from an inherent risk perspective. What we want to know is that, hey, this is the first time we did it, and so we had 27 vendors that warranted review because they represented either critical or high risk, and we had a total of 66 vulnerabilities across those 27 vendors. The critical risk vulnerabilities, were these 3 bullet points here. The high risk vulnerabilities were these 4 bullet points here. Noticing that we're not even mentioning vendor names in this. And by the way, your vendor owners will really appreciate that. But what we want the board to understand is that this is the residual risk that we're wrestling with. And we're working with these vendors. Now, I will caution you, a lot of times I've been in board meetings where they're like, well, who are the 2 vendors that don't have this or that didn't have that? And, you got to answer those questions and explain that, everybody has issues, and we're just identifying what the high-risk issues are so that we can work with them. Sometimes you might have to change vendors, but usually you can work with your vendors and find out that, they might be working on implementing, in this case, and really I think I can't name the core provider that this report's from a few years back, but if you're a customer of that core provider, you probably recognize this particular deficiency. But the thing I want to stress is that what we're talking about is residual risk by the time we're reporting it to the board. The board doesn't care about inherent risk. That's the risk before we've done our work. And so, back to the, beginning, we are going to sort our vendors by critical risk. The regulated vendors, by the way, are those vendors who are required by agreement to be in an examination program. And so it would include your correspondent banks, your credit agencies, et cetera. Infotex is actually in an examination program with the FFIEC examination. We have a managed security services side of our business, so we watch bank networks on a regular basis. We have access to their network, so the FFIEC comes in every 2 years. We're on a 2-year cycle, and they examine us. But if we decided we didn't like them, or if we decided, we got a whole bunch of issues, we can say, hey, we're not going to let you in this year. And there's nothing they really have that can force us other than our reputational risk and stuff. It would be terrible if we did that, right? But we're not required to let them into our organization to review us. And so therefore, we're not a regulated vendor. I would maintain we're a high-risk vendor because we have access to information rather than possession of information, which would make us a critical risk vendor. But I will say also that some of our clients treat us as a critical risk vendor, and we're ready for them. Okay, but the point I'm trying to make here is that be careful when you've defined what your regulated vendor is, because it really needs to be those companies that aren't going to provide the due diligence information, or in the case of your correspondent bank, they're already being examined and audited, umpteen times a year because they're a bank. We believe that critical and high-risk vendors should provide assurance of controls. Assurance is not just, by the way, this is our threshold analysis. I'm looking at the time, so we haven't even started talking about the SOC 2 yet, so I'm kind of going to have to speed up a little bit here. But assurance doesn't have to be a SOC 2, but usually it ends up being a SOC 2. And by the way, this is just my little reminder that, once we end up with the current residual risk, then the vendor owners need to get busy, and they hate this part of the whole process because it's when they actually have to do work. And so they need the vendor owner, being the person at your bank who owns the relationship with the vendor. They're going to have to get on the phone for any higher critical risk finding and try to determine what other controls that particular vendor has in place. And you might be thinking, well, if they have a SOC 2, Isn't that all they need? No. The answer to that is no. You wouldn't need to review the SOC 2 if having a SOC 2 made them secure. Okay? So keep in mind, it's all relative. If you've ever been to any of my, risk management workshops, you'll realize that I kind of am a purveyor of relativity when it comes to risk management, meaning that when you develop rules like this saying that, hey, if it's already happening, it means a 7 or 8, and if it never happens, it means a 1 or 2, you end up throwing those rules out in certain situations. And so what we want to do is we want to end up having an approach where we can say, hey, what controls should we expect? Do they have those controls in place? Are they testing those controls? And if not, which is no right here, right, then we're going to risk rank it. And this, our programs use likelihood on a scale of 1 to 8 and impact on a scale of 1 to 5. And so this particular issue with this particular vendor, which Soylent Corp is not a vendor, of course, but, it turned out to be, for this particular bank, an 8, which is moderate risk, meaning that the vendor owner doesn't really have to deal with it. On the other hand, this particular control, formal written policies and procedures that are, and unfortunately we didn't do a good job of, row height, but basically it's, do we have policies and procedures to make sure our users are governed by, an acceptable use policy. This particular vendor did not have that. Actually, there was reasons why I'm looking at the wrong one, but there was reasons they had other mitigating controls in place, so we gave them a 5. The likelihood of them faking this, I think, is probably what this says here, is low, and so, the risk ended up being low. On the other hand, they didn't have an incident response plan, and they were a payroll provider, and so we felt like, boy, if there's an incident, they should be able to respond to it, and so that's the one that ended up being high risk, and therefore the vendor owner should get back with the vendor and basically make sure that we understand, why didn't your SOC 2 test an incident response plan? And by the way, they did, in this case, test controls for logging incidents, so we suspect they might have one, but the SOC 2 didn't mention anything, and it didn't test anything, and so therefore it ended up being high risk. What we typically see in a bank is that when they've gotten done with their threshold analysis, they have between a half a dozen and 9 critical risk vendors and maybe the same number of high risk vendors, leaving them with between 9 to 15 SOCs that they need to review. We, are getting pretty good at it, but if you review a dozen SOCs a year, it might take you 4, hours to review the first one, and then maybe down to around 2-3 hours to review the rest of them. So it's kind of a time-consuming process. If I was in an actual workshop setting, I'd give away a prize if you got this answer right, but I usually like to play trivia games, and so I always bring this one up in the vendor management workshop. So if you do attend that one in December, you might win this because you've already seen this before. But what the SSAE-16 is a formal standard published by the American Institute of CPAs, the AICPA Society is what I've been referring to them as, and it governs their attestation engagement. In other words, they're going to go in, they're going to audit a particular organization, and they're going to attest to the veracity of the controls that organization declares. And the most important word in that sentence is the word declares. There are other forms of assurance that are just as legitimate as the SSAE-16. We've seen a lot of agreed upon procedures where, the vendor is basically saying, I don't want to go through all the, work of a SOC, but I do need an audit, so I'm going to get agreed upon procedure. A lot of times what it is they'll come in with a regular full-blown IT audit, and then they tack on at the end of it an executive summary that the vendor can then send out to banks. But you can get executive summaries directly out of audit reports. You can get affidavits of controls. I would always encourage you to try to talk them into putting under penalty of perjury in their affidavits. That usually causes them to pause. It's almost like a test, because if they're going to perjure themselves by doing what management said and sending out an affidavit, and they're not completely sure that the control's in place, they might slow down a little bit. Just a heads up, I think this is going to spill over about 10 minutes. I'm really not going as fast as I was supposed to through this webinar. Meanwhile, I always get this question, you know, I have a vendor that doesn't have a SOC 2. Are they secure? Or, well, we didn't do anything beyond just getting the SOC 2 because the SOC 2 means they're secure, doesn't it? No, no. A vendor who doesn't have a SOC 2 needs different types of scrutiny. We need to take a look, well, what do you have? Okay? But very, very important to know is that if you have a SOC 2, it doesn't make you secure. It doesn't mean that you're a secure organization. We've tested, back in the SAS-70 days, we tested an organization, was not a bank, that had an it had a SAS-70 Type 2. They were very proud of it, and they were using the default password on their firewall, so we owned their network like within 5 minutes of starting the test. A SOC 2 doesn't make you secure. And likewise, if they don't have a SOC 2, it doesn't mean they're insecure, but it does mean that they didn't spend the money they probably should have spent if they're working with banks to prove that they're secure. So I would definitely look at their financial statements, but also I'd be asking, well, what type of assurance do you have? What can you do to assure me that you have the controls in place, number 3 of the 4 promises, and that you're testing those controls, number 4 of the 4 promises. So I really want to quickly go through the SOC 1 is what a lot of times you'll get from a vendor that really should have a SOC 2. The SOC 2 is basically the type of audit engagement that says, hey, this vendor is working with other people. They end up possessing other people's information, so we're going to test the way this vendor protects third parties' information. The SOC 1 is, hey, this vendor is a publicly held company, and therefore, because of the Sarbanes-Oxley regulations that resulted from the law that was developed in 2002 as a response to WorldCom and Enron imploding and defrauding their shareholders, we want this vendor to test the controls over their financial statements. And really from a confidentiality, availability, and integrity perspective, we want to test this vendor's integrity control. Well, a SOC 1 or a SOC 2 Type 2 report means that the auditor camps out in your organization. You got to set them up an office, and they stay there for 6 months. And so that becomes very, very expensive. Imagine paying your auditors to be there for 6 months. I mean, we're already expensive enough as it is to be there for a week, right? And so the organizations that are required to get SOC 1s, a lot of times will say, boy, I don't know if I want to spring for another 6 months worth of auditors, A, and B, another $100,000 or whatever it's going to cost to get the audit. And by the way, $100,000 is just what our size company would have to pay. I don't know what a core processor would have to pay for their SOC 2. So the point being is that what a lot of times will happen is that a vendor will get a SOC 1, but they'll declare the controls that should be declared in both a SOC 1 and a SOC 2. Therefore, they're getting some economies. It's still a 6-month audit, and they're getting, a bigger bang for the buck. And so that's the reason why you're all here at this workshop, is because you're wondering, well, boy, you know, what's the difference between a SOC 1 and SOC 2? And when you find out what the difference, the question usually is, well, can we accept the SOC 1? And our answer is, it doesn't really matter. What matters is, what controls are they declaring? Are those the controls that we would expect? And are they testing those controls? And really, I said that a little bit wrong in terms of the order. It should really be, what controls should we expect? Are they declaring those controls? And if they are declaring those controls, are they being tested? The SOC 3 is just a summary of a SOC 1 or a SOC 2 in a manner that can make it public. And so a lot of companies will get a SOC 3 if they're collecting customers by their internet presence. So in other words, if you can engage with customers and get through the whole process without actually meeting the person, a SOC 3 is kind of helpful, because you can just post that on your website, and then everybody realizes, okay, they must have a SOC 1 or a SOC 2, and, you know, most people aren't going to post that if there's any deficiencies in it, because they stand out sore thumb in a SOC 3. Okay? And so we already talked about why I pray for both, but I just want to stress to you that the main goal that you have when it comes to SOC is to determine, are they declaring the controls that I want them to have in place, because they are possessing the information. They might be developing applications to use those, that information. They might even be developing applications that our customers use in order to, process the information that we're giving them. And then if there is a difference, we need the vendor owners to investigate. And so a typical report, and by the way, we are making that available to you on our portal, or actually I don't think it's on the portal anymore now that we're using GoToWebinar. I believe that Mike's probably already sent this to you. But this little document here, oh, by the way, I didn't have this. Mike's going to provide a PDF of PowerPoint to you when he can. But this is from the AICPA Society. I think it's very important. Oh boy, it didn't open up in the right window. It's very important that you look at this, because this is the target that auditors should be shooting for. I am amazed by the fact that every time I look at a SOC 2, it looks different every time, and I realize that the content's going to look different. But I tell you, if you're getting a SOC 2 and you don't recognize the accounting firm, and you go out and Google them and it looks like a 1 or 2 person organization, you might want to send them this so that they at least know what their SOC 2s are supposed to look like. Okay, and this also can kind of give whoever's going to be the one reviewing the SOC 2 in your organization a good feel for what should be in a typical SOC 2. And I'm not going to walk you through the whole thing in terms of time, but while I'm out here, I'll also show you that this is the cost. I guess I already had this open. This is the very important spreadsheet that really is the result of everything I'm trying to say to you in a very short period of time here. All of our boilerplates start off with this template that basically establishes once you customize this to your own organization, you are allowed to have, we give you the copyright to it. You're not infringing upon our copyright. But in consideration of that, we don't want you to just start, posting this Excel spreadsheet on FSI-SAC, or, emailing it out to all your bank peers in your, peer review organization or whatever. Obviously your auditors are going to see it and that sort of thing when they audit you. But we would rather you keep this, to yourself, because we like selling these things online. We have instructions here that, haven't been updated for a while, but I'm pretty sure they're pretty accurate. I'm going to have our team go through these and update them before our next workshop. That's when we update our boilerplate, so it won't be until December. This is kind of old. It's just for, back in the day, we were trying to help people understand the difference between an SSAE-16 and a SOC 2. But then we have the SSAE-16 checklist, which I'm going to try to get to be a reasonable size so it's easier for you. At least, you're not going to have time to read the words anyway, but, you can see what I'm pointing to here. But what the SSAE-16 checklist is that once we've established what the controls are, we still want to take a look at the document, in total, just to make sure that it's the right type of document, that the right person, signed the report, et cetera, et cetera. And then, by the way, this is where we pull the expected controls into the document. And what I want you to know is that if you need to do a less robust SSAE-16 review, we do have a method for that down here, where basically we're saying, hey, if you don't want to use the expected controls tab, you can still question whether the SOC has these general controls, and if they don't, then we can risk rank them. Okay, so this is a quicker review. If you are using the expected controls tab, you don't want to use any of these columns. You want to use no over here in the risk applicability, which basically means it won't include these in the metrics. The next tab then is the actual expected controls tab. I have it first mainly because of the fact that it comes first in the process, and unless you're not going to use the expected controls tab, as I just talked about. You want to describe the vendor, use your bank name. You probably don't need to include that. We put it because we do it for other banks. But when you describe the vendor, some of the things you need to be thinking about is, do they possess information or do they access information? If they don't possess information, their business continuity plan might not be that important, right? Do they develop applications? If they're not developing applications, we can say no to all the application security expected controls over here in the expected controls column, right? If they are developing applications, do our customers use them? Because there are additional application security controls that we might want to consider, and if they don't have them in place, to me, the impact is higher because our customers are going to see when a thing blows up or whatever. So anyway, those are questions in the description of the vendor that will help you decide what controls to expect. And then you really need to go through all these and decide, well, what controls are we going to expect? And then once you've gone through that, it's really a matter of a keyword search. And so we've included some sample keywords over here just to kind of get you started on it. You know, we've been doing this again and again and again, so we have a host of keywords, but we don't want to give you everything. And so, you know, I mean, if you're doing your own SOC 2s, you probably already have your own keyword list. Maybe you populate this field with what you already know works from a keyword search perspective. But the bottom line is that if you're wanting to see if they actually are declaring password complexity, you would search for that twice. You would search for it first to see if they're declaring it. If you find that, great. And then you need to search to see if the auditor is testing the password complexity. If they're declaring it, but it's not being tested, you know, that's a little less risk than if they're not declaring it at all. But what we want to see is that they're declaring it, which is promise 3, and they're testing it, which is promise 4. Make sense? Well, I can't see if you're nodding your head yes or no, so I'm going to assume that makes sense. But then once we decide the controls that haven't been tested, you know, it says no here, then on a scale of 1 to 8, we decide what the likelihood is. On a scale of 1 to 4, we decide what the impact is. And that's really another workshop, but suffice it to say what we usually go by is that if it's going to compromise all information, then we think the impact would be a 5. If it's going to compromise some information, maybe the impact is a 4. If it's merely compliance risk or business continuity risk, then maybe the impact is a 3. Unless it's customer facing, then maybe from an availability perspective, the impact would be a 4. It's all relative. You get to break the rules because it all depends on a specific situation. So I better get back to my PowerPoint to make sure that I stay on schedule here. So we've gone through the typical report, you know, and I don't have time to go through the sections, but if you read through that, you'll see, and I bet most of you are familiar with the report already, or at least, you know, what a non-typical report is, because very rarely do the reports match up to what the AICPA Society says the report should be. I already took a look at the sample report. I didn't really spend time on the sections because I'm running out of time here, and it's not on our portal. I think Mike's probably already posted it in GoToWebinar here. So we're so used to saying GoToMeeting. If I've already said GoToMeeting, I apologize for that. So we talked about the 2 primary components of the SSAE-16 review approach. The first is, what should we expect? And by the way, I have a client who is engaging with a government organization, and they went through a lot of work to try to decide whether they needed a SOC 2, and thankfully, before they signed any agreements, the government agency said, no, we don't want to use a SOC 2 because they don't test what should be tested. And so they gave them this huge spreadsheet that they did a control self-assessment on. It was much, much more robust than any kind of SOC 2 review. And so I'm just wanting to stress that this is very important because I don't know if I said this, but when you engage for a SOC, you tell the auditors what to look at. They don't come in and look at everything. They say, declare your controls and we'll test those controls. So if you're having issues with, you know, your application security process, you know, let's say that you're still not testing, running, you know, a vulnerability scanner on applications before you post and move new code to the production environment, well, then just don't declare that control. They won't test it, and therefore you won't have a deficiency there. Does that make sense? And so the main thing is that our review checklist is really geared towards helping you decide what should we expect, and then the real work is in searching that SOC 2 for the controls that you're expecting based on keywords. And what I really want to stress that you've got to be careful here. If it says no over here, there shouldn't be anything over here. Okay, if it says yes here, then you need to have something over here, right? Either it should say I couldn't find the control, or I found the control, they declared it, but they didn't test it, or I found the control, they declared it and tested it. And if the latter is the case, you put yes here. If it says yes here, then it should say 0 over here. If it says no here, and it's because they declared it but they didn't test it, to me the likelihood of that, usually the likelihood of them declaring a control and not testing it and then the control is not in place is pretty low, because again, the auditors are camping out there. For a type 2, the auditors are camping out there for 6 months. If it's a type 1 report, by the way, then it's more like an audit of, where we go in and we audit a bank and, we're on site for a week or so. That's a type 1. And so you really want a type 2. At least if it's a critical vendor, you should get a type 2. The type 1s obviously are a lot less expensive. If it's a high-risk vendor where they only have access to information, a type 1 SOC 2 is probably acceptable. Again, I use the word probably because it's all relative to the situation, what the vendor's doing, what they have, etc. If the vendor is your data center, maybe the impact of availability controls would be a 5, not a 3. Because the reason we're using a data center is because they're supposed to be available 24/7 by 365. Okay, so it's all relative. If they're not declaring it and they're not testing it, then yeah, the likelihood might be a little higher. Okay. The other thing is there are certain types of controls where maybe they're declaring it but not testing it. And a great example of what I'm saying here is like password complexity, totally settled law. If they're declaring it but not testing it, I'm pretty sure they still have password complexity in place, right? But if it's application security, that's something that's kind of new to most vendors. And so if they're saying, if they're declaring your control but not testing it, the likelihood, maybe the likelihood isn't a 7, maybe it's a 5, but it's certainly not a 3, which is what we might put on something else. I put that in the wrong column there, but you get the point. Just because they're declaring and not testing a control doesn't always mean the likelihood is lower. As a bank, if you're saying, yep, we have a vendor management program, that doesn't mean the auditor is going to agree with you, right? And so you might declare that control, but the control is so complex that the likelihood of you having the control in place and it not working right might be higher than password complexity, as an example. But anyway, there's 68 potential questions. Well, actually, there's 62 potential questions, and then we're not perfect, and there might be controls that you would expect that's not in this checklist. So you just enter them here, put a yes here, and then look for them in the SOC 2. At the end of this this tab here, then we end up inventorying the number of expected controls, how many of them were sufficiently tested, how many of them weren't, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the bottom of the SSAE-16 checklist, which is more geared on the report, centered around the report instead of the expected controls, I'm using a Lenovo laptop. I recommend you don't use a Lenovo laptop when you're giving presentations. But anyway, what I was going to say is at the bottom of that spreadsheet, what you're going to find is there's a risk ranking, and it's really handy. It's kind of an algorithm that we've developed, and we've kind of modified it over time, but it ends up being really handy to compare vendors to each other. And when we do a SOC review, we'll actually show your vendors in relationship to other vendors. We don't include their names, but that way you can see how your vendors stack up compared to other vendors that banks are working with. SOCs very rarely cover business continuity. Accounting firms are finally out there trying to hire our people away from us so that they can do application security reviews. It's got to be an accounting firm, by the way, that does an SSAE-16 review. I mean, Infotex probably has the capability of doing it, but we don't have CPAs on staff, so we don't have anybody to look over our audit controls. We do have a CPA look over our audit controls on an annual basis, but not on a customer-by-customer basis. Which is the reason why a CPA firm needs to do the SOC 2 reviews. Very rarely do we see accounting firms doing penetration testing. Really what they're looking at is general IT controls, the non-technical controls. And then very often we'll see that SOC 2s don't, address the hot examination topics. Certainly I have not seen a SOC 2 yet that has as a control. We did a cybersecurity assessment using the FFIEC's, cybersecurity assessment tool, and that might be because they still haven't published the one that they've promised for TSP or for third-party service providers. Business continuity, I am seeing a little bit more, but a lot of times what they'll do is they'll either declare it as a control and not test it because it's pretty expensive to test a business continuity plan, or they might be having more technical firms test them on a regular basis. But it also might not even declare it a control, but include a lot of information about their business plan, business continuity plan in the back section, which is, just information provided by the vendor, not in the form of declared controls. Application security, I am now starting this, it's been changing. Back in January when we first did this webinar, you see the first bullet point there. But we are now actually seeing some of the new SOC 2s that, really were from the last semester of 2015 are starting to at least declare application security. They probably, if they're not testing them, it's probably because the accounting firm is busy, with those people they hired away from us, having their application security people. And by the way, nobody hired anybody from us. We don't have a lot of turnover in our company. But my point is that accounting firms didn't have the technical capability of doing these kinds of reviews, and they're now going out and getting it. So I think that going forward, we're going to be able to rely on these SOCs to make sure that application security is addressed. I always look for, well, what framework are they using? If they're not declaring a framework, then it kind of makes me suspect that they really know what they're doing. Penetration testing, I just don't see that very often because it's a lot cheaper to have a company that's a specialist in penetration testing do it. I feel that incident response is a very, very important thing to make sure is in the SOC 2. You saw, that if it wasn't, we gave it a high risk ranking. It really relates to that second promise. If there's a breach, will you know it? Because, boy, is that going to be embarrassing if there's a breach and then you find out about it 6 months later because one of my customers is telling me about it because, their information was what was breached. DDoS response, if the vendor's availability is important, you better make sure that they're testing this in their SOC 2. And then again, your job is to decide what should we expect, what are they testing, and then risk ranking it. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of skip that next section because I want to get a little bit to, the reporting process. And so what I wanted you to know is that here's a good example. When we review a SOC 2, what we'll do is we'll put the banks that we're, working with, vendors, in one color, and then the last 10 or 12, all depending on, how many, we have with the type of engagement that, is typical with these three, so that you can see how your vendors are doing in relationship to other vendors. And again, this is the metric that's at the bottom of the SSAE-16 checklist. Let's see if the Lenovo finally let me have access to my, and so this is the total risk. Of course, we didn't fill anything out, and so, our algorithm tells me that the algorithm's right because it's supposed to be a 1 if we didn't fill anything out. The number of expected controls, I think, is an important metric because of the fact that it helps you understand if somebody's missing a lot of controls, but we're expecting all 62, that's different than someone who's missing 30 controls and we're expecting 30 controls. I will say that, we typically see a vendor, a good solid vendor with a good risk rating over here, this rating here, come on, if somebody's up here, they're usually about still 80% in terms of tested controls. In other words, they're not testing everything, and a lot of times it's because of economy. And so when you reach out and say, hey, I noticed you didn't test the 20% of the controls we're expecting, they'll say, well, that's because we have somebody else testing our business continuity plan. Here's their affidavit of results there. That's because we tested antivirus for the last, 15 years, and so we decided to skip a year. Here's the, memo we have written, related to that, et cetera. Okay, and again, the number of expected controls becomes an important metric for that reason. the number of deficiencies that's actually in the report, or the percent completion on those expected controls are also important. If someone has deficiencies in their SOC, that means they weren't ready for their SOC. And so to me, having a deficiency is something that you should pay close attention to. Now, usually the management responses are very important too, and a good example of that is I can say, we can look at 2 SOCs. One says that, we tested 600 users and 2 of them were not set up according to the user installation policy. Okay, well, that isn't that bad. The management response, doesn't even matter in that one because that's a pretty low percentage. But another one could say the vendor has 60 administrators and 5 of them didn't have the right, approval, or they weren't supposed to be administrators. Well, that indicates a much bigger problem, in my opinion, than the first one. And so again, it's all relative, and that's why you need to risk rank the deficiencies. But even at that, even that vendor that only had 2, by the way, Mike, is the webinar still going? I see that the time is off, and this is the first time we use GoToWebinar, so I'm hoping everybody can still hear me.
Yeah, we're good.
But anyway, pardon me?
We're good. We're still going.
Okay. Anyway, the point being is that what I kind of threw me off, so I don't know what point I was leading towards. Average risk ranking, that's basically what's the average risk of the missing controls. And this is important because a lot of times a vendor might have, 30 missing controls, but only 1 of them is high risk, the rest of them are low risk. Well, that kind of helps you understand that, hey, this vendor might look like they've got issues because their percent completion is 50% or something, but really what they're missing makes sense that we're not going to test that control because it has nothing to do, or it has a lot less to do with what, they're looking at. And actually, when I look over our SOC 2 reviews, if I see medium percentage but a low average risk ranking, I want to get back to my people and say, hey, I think we might have, declared too many expected controls. I think we're expecting more out of this vendor than we should be expecting. And then again, the total residual risk, that's that metric that's at the bottom of that spreadsheet. And by the way, this is kind of how we present that. We basically list all the vendors, or in our case, we're able to list the client's vendors in context with other vendors that we're looking at with the same type of services and such. And then this is the number that's at the bottom of the spreadsheet. And then, this is the average risk ranking. And so you can see somebody might have a high residual risk, but not that bad of a risk ranking. This tries to take everything into consideration, this algorithm here. So this is the one I would really, focus in on in terms of, how good is my vendor doing relative to another vendor. If they have a lot of high-risk missing controls, they're guaranteed to be very high on this scale here. I mean, if you see that, there's 12 here, 164 there, that sort of thing. I'm sorry that I ended my webinar the way I did, late, and without realizing that the ending was coming up.
We appreciate your time today, and Dan, appreciate your time. And if there's no further questions, then we will conclude this webinar.
Well, just one thing I'd like to add, Mike, is I appreciate your appreciation.
Thank you, Dan. I would go one further, but then we'd just be here all day.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dan.
See you around. Bye.
When you view an InfoText webinar or movie, you do so with 4 caveats. First, you're agreeing to the terms posted at the web page listed on this slide. Second, our lawyers want you to know that what InfoText presents is often time-dated or about new trends, regulations, or guidance, and therefore we cannot provide this material with any warranty whatsoever. Thirdly, material provided with InfoText webinars and movies is copyrighted. You keep the copyright to material customized to your organization, but InfoText reserves the right to use the material in other engagements and boilerplates. See our transfer of copyright agreement at the webpage listed in this slide. Finally, those who view our webinars or movies may be added to an email mailing list. If you do not wish to receive notice of additional educational opportunities, please accept our apologies and please opt out at the web page shown on this slide.